Step 1, remove the 2 nuts that hold on the overflow tank. Just pull the hose out and then remove the overflow tank. Step number 2, remove the 4 bolts that hold the cover on. According to the service manual, this is the point where we will drain the coolant. Now, it's right above the battery connections. So first, we'll remove this unit, just taking note of all the connections. I think there's a connector back here that we'll disconnect. And then once this is clear and out of the way of the drain path, then we'll go ahead and disconnect this hose and drain the coolant. These 3 fasteners, by removing those, the air intake will come off, and note that there is the flame arrestor inside. So I'll remove these 2 fully and partially remove the 3rd at the top and try to pull the entire unit off together so the flame arrestor doesn't just fall down through and maybe hit the floor, get broken. And next we will remove the fuel line. Next step is to loosen this hose clamp and remove this coolant hose from the fitting. Chances are this is going to be a very messy part of the job, so just make sure to have tons of rags and catch containers ready to go for this portion. Okay, next we'll remove this connector, and we will remove the hose right here that runs between this connection point and then down over to the intake manifold side. Also, remove the connections here. This is for the choke assembly, so remove those. It'll make getting this tube off a little bit easier. So I didn't fully remove this hose. Just let it stay in place on this side. Pulled it down underneath the rail. We will then remove this hose here that runs down. That one will come completely off. And be sure, once that hose is removed, to put a piece of tape or something to cover the opening into the crankcase. All right, next, simply for ease of access, going to remove this bracket using that nut and that bolt. Next is to remove the carburetor assembly using these 2 bolts here. And this whole thing will come off as one assembly. As it comes off, you'll just watch these connections here. You can rotate the carburetor assembly and get those to come apart as you're pulling the entire assembly off. And then once removed, highly recommend bagging up to protect your carburetor from any dust or debris while the rest of the work goes on. Next, we will remove the intake manifold using the 4 bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4 on either side. And 1, 2, 3, 4. Do follow the service manual. There is a recommended installation procedure. It's kind of like a cross pattern, I guess, to help avoid warping, just making sure everything's seated evenly. I'm going to follow that same loosening procedure for removing the 8 bolts. Next, we will remove this hose clamp and this one here as well. We won't remove this hose or this hose from the thermostat cover, but we will just take those clamps off. We'll take it off here, here, and then take these 2 bolts out, and then the whole cover assembly will just come off with those hoses. Next, we've removed the spark plug. Going to loosen this clamp, move it up the hose, and just pull this hose off of the head and just up and out of the way. We will also remove this connector right here and just let it hang off to the side. And next, we'll remove the 4 bolts that hold the valve cover on, which gives us access to all 5 of the head bolts. Now there is a loosening procedure here as well, and it's a star pattern. So we'll hit this one first, this one second, third, fourth, and then last 5th. And then at that point, the head will be ready to remove. There are 2 more bolts, come to think of it, before you can remove it, and it's these 2 here. Those are from the exhaust manifold. Those will also need to be removed in order to remove the head. One more note when removing the head is to make sure your piston is at top dead center. It'll make that a little bit easier because there won't be any tension or pressure on the push rods. So we'll take the gasket off. Make sure you don't drop the 2 pins. There's a pin here and there's a pin here. Those came out luckily, no problem this time. Didn't have to fish anything out and was able to bag those up as well. There's also a gasket here for the exhaust, so that'll probably drop as you remove it. But now we have access to the head, and we will begin on the other side, tearing down deeper so that we can get into the side cover of the engine and get to that piston. Now we will remove the 22 pin connector from the control box. Now we will disconnect the controller ground strap from the generator side, this green wire coming in right here. Then we will remove the fuel inlet hose. As you can see, there are some additional wires that come through the opening here, through the sound shield. And over on the forward side of the generator is where those connections are made. You can see the off-color white connections up inside. In order to get to these, I think it's going to be beneficial to take the exhaust manifold off, as well as the heat exchanger. So I'm going to disconnect these 2 hoses here. Look for any wiring that might be connected on this side. And then on the aft end, we know that there is a wire here that's connected, as well as some cooling hoses. And then we will have the bolt, and it looks like there's an Allen head bolt kind of deep inside there. Those are the 2 bolts that go into the aft cylinder head. So we'll go ahead and remove all of those components. We will start with the heat exchanger by removing this hose, and then the 4 bolts that hold it to the exhaust. Hoses came off nicely. And working on the 4 bolts. In order to get access or better access to the forwardmost bolt, just loosen this nut up so you can rotate these wires without damaging anything. One thing to mention is this location here is where the thermostat is located on the heat exchanger. And with the heat exchanger removed, we now have much better access to disconnect these 2 off-white connectors here. These 2 feed into this bundle right here, which goes up inside the control box. The other one, this passes underneath and does come over to this connector. So I'm going to disconnect this. On this particular configuration, we have a single circuit breaker for 120 volt, 60 hertz operation. So we have wires 2 and 4 going to the top of the circuit breaker. And then 1 and 3 are going to the L0 stud right there. We are now going to disconnect the P11 and P10 connectors. Per the service manual, these are the ones that have the FN and FP wires on the P11 and the F1 and F2 wires on the P10. This just helps identify that it's these two connectors that need to be disconnected. One final adjustment to being able to take the control box off. Coming from this connector here, you can see there is a wire, get a hold of it here, that runs down, and you can see it goes to that spade connector on the bottom of the fuse for the voltage regulator. So I will just be removing that spade connection there and taking note to reconnect it when we pull the wiring back through. Then it looks like this connector is going to be too thick to feed underneath the control box. So it's only 4 nuts that hold this box on, kind of in the 4 corners. And they're pretty easy to get to. So I'm just gonna go ahead and remove the box that way and then take the sound shield off. All right, control box is coming out pretty good. One thing to note, the wire, black wire marked 55 also comes up and goes to the top prong of that voltage regulator fuse. That one needs to be removed as well. And then this box will be off. All right, control box is off. Next step, I'm gonna get this exhaust manifold off the top to give a lot better access to remove the stator housing. So we'll start with removing the hose clamp. There's a few bolts, 2 right there underneath. And then once that hose clamp is off, you should be able to come over on this side, loosen up that hose clamp, take these 2 bolts out and this wire off right here, and then remove all of that. And at that point, with all the bolts removed and these here to the head, this manifold should come up and off. Okay, so something unexpected. When you pull this joint right here off of that location on the engine, there is a ball that fits in this kind of a cone right here, like a seat. So just be aware that when you go to pull that off, that ball, it's gonna fall or drop. And luckily, it didn't go rolling away, so we got it here. All right, the exhaust manifold is off. Next step is to disconnect this connector here and remove the fuel pump assembly. All right, now comes some fun stuff. I'm gonna take these 2 bolts off here and here. We're gonna remove the end cover plate. And when you pull that off, there is gonna be this coupler right here that adapts it to the rotor. All right, next we are going to push the brushes up into the retainer, and then in that small hole, we're gonna push our paper clip in to retain those brushes to protect them as we continue disassembly. So using a couple of picks, you're able to get underneath the brushes, and you can see they are now raised away from the rotor, and the paper clip has been inserted to hold them away. Next, we will remove the brush assembly with these two bolts. Moving on to the next step of loosening the vibrator mount bolts. So the bolt comes up from the bottom, so you do need access to that. So I pulled it off the table just far enough to get to both sides. Removing that nut from the top. That will allow us to lift up this end of the generator per the service manual to begin loosening the long over bolts. So we'll start this process next and see if hopefully this whole housing will come off together and we may not need to remove the leads. See, the block of wood is now placed to support the engine as the stator housing comes off. Big thing that you're trying to avoid happening here is the cap from separating from the housing. So I've got a couple pieces of tape around it, pretty long pieces, and it's the Gorilla tape, so it's good to hold everything here together because you just don't want that wire being pulled out from the brush holder. But yeah, so pulled those out all together, housing and the cap. And we'll sit this aside and keep on going. I'm gonna take off this end bolt here, this Allen, and take this rotor off. We don't want to damage that. All right, and the rotor is off after much work. If you follow the service manual, it's gonna be pretty frustrating and probably impossible to remove the rotor. What I ended up doing was took the bolt that holds in the rotor and measured how deep that was. You know, it basically inserted this and measured how deep it was. From there, I took a 1/4 inch rod and made a rod that fit up inside the rotor like so. And it went a little further than these threads at the end. That way there was about 1/2 inch of exposed threads or so. And then I took this bolt and threaded this in. So again, had about 1/2 inch of threads or so that were engaged to make sure we didn't strip anything out, and then started to tighten down on this bolt. And what that did was it just acted like a puller. So, you know, this rod was seated up here against the tapered shaft from the engine. And as that bolt pushed and pushed and pushed, it eventually got the rotor to pop loose. I did have to take the tap and clean out the threads on the engine. Just, you know, the first one got a little bit gummed up because of the rod, but it did clean up pretty nicely. And now the rotor is successfully off. Okay, so next step. Going to use our oil extractor to remove the oil from the crankcase. All right, oil is removed, and next we will remove the oil drain plug as well as the 4 bolts that hold the adapter plate on. All right, with the adapter plate off, just a little bit of housekeeping. Gonna remove this white wire from here so that we can take the harness and shift it over to the forward side of the engine to get it out of the way of the side cover. In order to remove the water pump housing, we'll remove these 4 bolts right here. And note the orientation of the bolts. The 2 short bolts go in the bottom. The long bolt with the 10mm head goes on the left side, and the long bolt with the 12mm head goes on the top. And with that removed, there's only 1 bolt remaining, this 10mm here, and then the second water pump housing will come off. And now the last step to get the side cover off is remove the remaining 6 bolts around the perimeter of the side cover. And then the side cover should come off and we will be into the engine. And note, when you remove these bolts, on the forward side, it's long bolt at the bottom, short bolt in the middle, long bolt up top. On the aft side, it's long bolt at the bottom, and then short bolts in the middle and the top. All right, want to take some time to go over the side cover. You can see here, we've got the governor gear, we've got the oil pump gear, and then we've got the strainer for the intake of the oil. And back over on the engine side, I wanted to point out that you've got 2 guide pins, one here and one here, and that there is a ball right here, which is part of the lubrication system, so just make sure that that doesn't fall out when you take the side cover off. And now that we've rotated it down, we have good access to the bolts to undo the connecting rod. Here we can see orientation of the split ring that comes off. So the groove was on the aft side, and you can see the orientation of the connecting rod as it comes out. All right, and here is the damaged piston coming out of the bore. So this is the orientation that the piston came out of the cylinder. All right, and out of an abundance of caution, decided that we are going to take off the aft cylinder head as well, just to make sure that there's no corrosion on this piston before we put everything back together. So similar to the other one, the 4 bolts, take off the cover, and then the 5 bolts for the head. Remember to use the star pattern as you remove to avoid warping, and we'll see what we got. So yeah, this piston is just as bad. We're gonna replace this one also. So again, we've got the 2 bolts, 1, 2. Pull those out and then push the piston out at the top. Just note the orientation, the stamp. This has the 2-1 is facing the side cover. Okay, now with the pistons out, we will remove the snap ring that holds in the pivot pin. We'll remove the pivot pin, and then we will replace the piston. New pistons are on, finally on the rebuilding process. And next we will put the piston rings on.